Okay, so welcome everybody. Before we begin, I just want to know if there's any particular questions you have about last week's class or about any of the classes that we have had so far. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put up a quick poll. So let me know if you can see the questions. There's 2 questions in the poll. I want you to take about a minute to answer both questions. All right. So the poll is launched. Can you see the poll? Anybody? Any one person, if you can just say if you can see it.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right. So please go ahead and answer these 2 questions. Okay. So for those of you who are just joining in, there's a couple of questions that you can see the polling that I'm doing right now. So if you can please answer these 2 questions, we'll get going with the rest of the class. So both of those are connected to somehow connected to this concept of normal depth and critical depth that we discussed last time in the context of gradually varied flow. Okay, so I've got one answer recorded in both questions. Okay. Okay. 2 people have voted. The rest of you, quickly. I'll give you another, let's say about 45 seconds. So please, quickly. If anybody can't see the poll, just unmute yourself and just say something. All right. 4 people have voted. 7 more have to vote. Quickly. 30 seconds left. Okay. Very good. Okay, 2 more people. Last 10 seconds. Quickly. Okay. I'm going to end polling right now. Okay, so everybody's voted. Very good. So I'm sharing the results. Can you see the answers? Can you see the results? Can everybody see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's look at the first question. For a given flow rate and channel cross section, if the normal depth of flow is less than the critical depth, the bed slope of the channel is said to be, the options are critical, steep, mild, and I don't know. So we have 8 answers saying it's steep. Okay, the normal depth of flow is less than the critical depth, right? Which means y naught is less than yc. Okay, so the correct answer is steep, and I'm happy to see that almost 80% of the class has got it right. So that's good. And then the next one, if the slope of a channel reduces, the normal depth of flow will, okay, if the slope of a channel reduces, the normal depth of flow, of course, it goes without saying that this is all for the same flow rate. right? The options are remain unchanged. Nobody has voted for that. Good. 3 people have said the normal depth of flow will decrease. Okay, 7 people have said it will increase, and of course 1 person has said it's I don't know. All right. So again, the answer is indeed increase. Okay. So if you remember, let me just write on the screen, Q, which is the flow rate, equal to 1 by N A R to the power 2 by 3 and S naught power half. So you can see the screen, right? So if S naught reduces, right, and if Q is the same and N is the same, the only thing that can change to ensure that this equation continues to hold good is that Y has to increase. The depth of flow has got to increase, right? So if the channel slope reduces, then the normal depth of flow will increase. All right. Okay. So I'm going to, so has the poll, let me close the poll results. Where are they? Okay. So stop sharing results. Okay. So now I think you can't see anything. All right. Okay. So we'll continue with our discussion on gradually varied flow. I'm going to quickly go to the slide where we stopped. So these were all, yes, last time's lecture. So we'll just quickly move past that. Okay, so we did all this. We classified the slopes. Then we went into these different kinds of mild slope, steep slope, and the different regions 1, 2, and 3, and so on. And then we also plotted the different types of profiles. And then we solved an example, and this is where we stopped last time. Okay, so we're going to continue from here. So the next slide is looking at the occurrence of these various GVF profiles in real scenarios. Okay, so for example, there's multiple different examples given over here. If a mild slope meets a milder slope, you get this kind of an M1 curve happening over there. And if you have a steep slope meeting steeper slope, all of these different illustrations are given. Okay, so you can go through all of these figures that illustrate the different kinds of GVF profiles that we get in different circumstances, right? So you can have a mild slope meeting a milder slope, or a milder slope meeting a mild slope, and so on. All of these different examples are all presented over here. You can take a look at them, at your own leisure. And then if you have any questions, hopefully you've all watched this in the video already, the recording that I sent earlier. And if you have any questions about this, we can discuss them right now, or we move on. Any questions?
Sir, the middle one, the top middle one.
Top middle one.
What are those round arrows?
Oh, this one. These round arrows. Okay. So
Yes.
these are what are called hydraulic jumps. This we will discuss in the next lecture. Okay. A hydraulic jump essentially happens when a supercritical stream and a subcritical stream meet. Okay. When a supercritical and a subcritical meet, it's very difficult for the flow to persist in that kind of a situation. So, because remember, for the same flow rate, supercritical to subcritical means what? If you remember from your specific energy diagram, those depths are far apart, right?
Yes.
Right. So let me just quickly draw the. So if I have the specific energy diagram, it will look something like this, right? So if I have for a given specific energy, right? If I have a supercritical stream which is at this depth, right? So let's call this depth Y1. It is meeting a subcritical stream which is at a depth of Y2. There's a big difference in the elevation of these two streams, or the depths in these two streams, right? So then you get this phenomenon of what is called a hydraulic jump. Okay, so this circular thing that you see over here is called a hydraulic jump. Okay, we'll discuss that in the next lecture. That will be the last and final lecture that we will do this semester. Okay, so this is a hydraulic jump. Okay, you'll understand that a little bit later when you attend next lecture. Okay, so other than that, any other questions? Yes.
Means, depth, depth is getting depth will be thin, height will be lesser, depth of the channel will be lesser when when the channel is through steeper slope na.
Correct.
So almost in every figure it is the same na. It is following the same rule.
Yes. No, not in almost every figure. In every figure, it is following that rule. When the slope is steep, the normal depth will be less.
So this is equivalent to that tap water falling na. Water falling from tap. Means as the acceleration is increasing, the water will get thinner.
Okay, you can think of it that way. Sure. The difference is that in that case, it keeps getting thinner and thinner in the case of a tap. Whereas in this case, it is approaching that idealization that we call uniform flow. Right?
Okay.
Assuming that the gravitational force is getting balanced by the frictional forces. And remember, as the velocity increases, friction also increases.
Right? When it reaches terminal velocity, then terminal velocity, then it will get uniform.
So the terminal velocity is when it is falling in air. Okay. In this context, in the context of open channel flow, that is what we call uniform flow. When that gravity and that friction are equally balanced, then what you call terminal velocity when it is falling through the atmosphere, you will call it as uniform flow in the case of open channel flow. Okay.
Sir,
yes.
I'm able to understand physics, but I'm able to understand this civil engineering, some kind of this lines, NDL, CDL. I'm unable to get.
So that is exactly what I was saying, right? So the NDL depends on the slope. The normal depth level or the normal depth line depends on the slope. Do you agree with that? You got to say something, yes or no? Okay.
We'll leave it here, sir.
Okay. All right. So,
sir,
yes.
It's better to leave it here. For others, I will sacrifice.
No. There's no question of sacrifice. If you have a question, I've always told you, you can email me, you can message me, we can have a WhatsApp call, we can schedule a different time, we can discuss it at any length you want. You want to discuss it for 10 hours, I'll sit and discuss it with you for 10 hours. Okay. But that is why I'm giving you the opportunity of asking questions outside of class hours also. It's not that you are limited to only asking it now, right? If it is truly bothering you, and if it's truly you're not able to understand what that implication is or what it means, you are absolutely at liberty to call me, from 9 in the morning to 9 in the night. You can call me at any time, right? Or if you want me to schedule a certain time, you let me know. I'll do it. No questions asked. All right. Okay. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay. So we are going to move on to the next concept, which is that of GVF computation, right? Gradually varied flow profile computation. When I say computation, I mean computing the length of the profile, right? So now at this point, you understand that if there is a change in the slope or whatever, you may a gradually varied flow profile may be set up. Okay. Now the intention that we have is to find out how long will this profile be. Okay. Will it be a few meters long, or will it be a few kilometers long, or what will it be? Okay. So our objective is to try to understand what the length of the gradually varied flow profile will be. Okay. So for this, we are going to use most popular method that's used is what is called the direct step method. Very simple and straightforward method. What it does, what this method does, is that it breaks up the profile into different depths. Okay. So let us say I tell you that the gradually varied profile is changing from an elevation of y1 to an elevation of y capital N. Okay, at some distance. I don't know what this distance is, but I know that the elevation is changing from this y1 to this yn. Okay, and then I ask you, how long, what distance, over what distance will this change happen? Will it change from y1 to yn in 1 kilometer or 10 kilometers or 100 meters, or what is it? Okay. So for that, once I know these two, once I know the ends, once I know this end condition and this end condition, this is only possible if I know what this end is and this end is, right? I should know yn and y1. If I know those two, then what I do is I break up the difference between yn and y1 into n number of pieces, right? Each with a different height, right? yn minus 1, yn minus 2, dot dot dot, yi plus 1, yi minus 1, dot dot dot, y2, y1. Okay, so I break it up into multiple pieces. I break up the entire profile into multiple pieces where I know the different values of y. Okay, and then I say I will try to find out the distance between each of these successive water depths, right? So I'll break up my entire profile into multiple water depths and try to find the distance between each successive water depth, right? Suppose I find this delta x between yi and yi plus 1, delta x between yi plus 1 and I plus 2, delta x between I plus 3, I plus 4, and so on. I just keep going all the way to yn, and then similarly I find delta x all the way to y1. I sum up all those delta x's, that will give me the total length of the profile, right? Is that idea clear? I'm just breaking up the problem into smaller pieces and then computing the delta x over which this change will happen. Each change will happen over some x length delta x, right? I know how many pieces I've broken it up into. I know the delta x for each of those pieces. I sum up all the delta x's, that will give me the total length L between y1 and yn, correct? Is that clear? Anybody has any questions on that? Okay, so it's a fairly straightforward approach. So I use this information to find out delta x for each interval. Okay, at each interval, I also happen to know two other pieces of information. I also know what is the vi square or the vi, the velocity at cross section I, and velocity at cross section I plus 1, right? If I know vi and vi plus 1, I can also compute vi square by 2g and vi plus 1 square by 2g, right? Which is the remaining component of the energy, right? Or specific energy, sorry. Y plus v square by 2g is your specific energy, if you remember. Okay, so that knowledge we will use to try to understand what delta x should be if I know yi and vi and yi plus 1 and vi plus 1, right? If I know all of these pieces of information, can I find out delta x? That is the question. Okay, so the approach we'll take is fairly straightforward. Let's just walk through it. Okay, if you remember, in our earlier slide, we had derived this equation dy by dx plus d by dx of v square by 2g equal to s naught minus sf, right? We had derived this expression. If you go back to your previous lectures recording, you'll see this, right? So what is this? Dy by dx plus d by dx of v square by 2g is nothing but dE by dx, where E is the specific energy, dE by dx equal to s naught minus sf, right? Because this is d by dx of y plus v square by 2g, right? This entire expression is d by dx of y plus v square by 2g. What is y plus v square by 2g? It is simply specific energy E, right? So I can write it as dE by dx equal to s naught minus sf. All right. Now what I'm going to do is, since I have broken down my entire problem, this equation that I've written is an ordinary differential equation. Okay, it's an ordinary differential equation. But because we have broken it up into smaller pieces, we will write it in the form of a finite difference approximation. You've all learned about finite difference and all that, right, in your mathematics courses? Finite differences, you know that? Yes?
No, sir.
Not everybody has learned finite differences?
Maybe once if you tell something, we may remind.
Okay. So, central difference, backward difference, forward difference, you've learned that? Yes, no?
No, sir.
No? Okay. All right. So basically it's a numerical approximation technique. Okay. So I'm saying dE by dx equal to s naught minus sf. This is a continuous, this is assuming that E is a continuous function, right? E is a continuous function. Only then you can write it in this kind of a format. But what I do is instead of solving it at every point in that continuum, I'm going to break it up like I just did in the previous slide. I broke it up into smaller pieces, right? So this dE by dx, I can also write it as delta E by delta x, right? And equate it to S naught minus SF bar, right? Because S naught does not change in space, but SF changes at every point, correct? At every point in this slope, the energy line slope here is something else. At this point, it is something else, right? So at cross section I, there will be a certain value of the energy slope SFI. SFI will be some value over here, and SFI plus 1 will be some other value over here, right? So this SF is constantly changing as I move from I to I plus 1 to I plus 2 and so on. So what I do is I evaluate it as SF bar, the average between I and I plus 1. Okay. How do I write delta E by delta X? Delta E by delta X is simply E of I plus 1 minus E of I, right? So now I just cross multiplied. I've written it in this form. Delta X equal to E of I plus 1 minus E of I divided by S naught minus half of SFI plus SFI plus 1. You understand what I've done over here? I've simply taken delta X to the other side and brought this to the denominator. And then I get delta X equal to EI plus 1 minus EI divided by S naught minus half of the average at locations I and I plus 1. Right? So SFI plus SFI plus 1 divided by 2 is the average of the energy slope between these 2 points in that cross section, right? So this is a numerical approximation of this equation. This equation that you see over here, dE by dx equal to S naught minus SF, is a continuous equation, right? It's assuming that E is a continuous function. It is a continuous function, right? But I don't want to evaluate it at infinite points all along that slope. I have broken it up into a finite number of pieces, right? So this is how I evaluate this dE by dx in terms of what is called the finite difference approximation. Finite difference. I've broken it up into finite pieces, and so I'm computing the difference between those 2 pieces, right? Because there's a gradient of
Yes,
E,
sir.
so I'm breaking it up in this form. All right. So delta X equal to EI minus 1 minus EI, which is delta E, divided by S naught minus SF bar, which is this denominator term. All right. So now it's fairly straightforward. You can very easily find EI. What is EI? EI is simply YI plus Q square by 2G AI square, right? EI at every cross section, I know what is the value of Y. The flow rate will be known. And because I know Y, I can find A, right? Because I know the shape of the cross section. I know that it is a rectangular cross section, or I know that it is a triangular or a trapezoidal or whatever. I know the relationship between A and Y. So if I know Y, I can infer what A will be. So then I can infer what this entire term will be, which is my EI, right? I can compute this EI at every point. I can compute it at I equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to capital N, which is the total length that we are interested in solving for, right? So that is how I'll compute EI. What about SF bar? SF bar, I will use the Manning's equation. Remember what we did for gradually varied flow? If you remember, we said that for Manning's for the gradually varied flow, we can write Manning's equation with this correction: 1 by n a square r to the power 4 by 3. Oh, sorry, r to the power 2 by 3 times, instead of S naught per half, we replace it with SF per half, right? So that is what I'm doing here. So SF equal to n square q square, right? N square q square divided by a square, a square r to the power 2 by 3 square, right? If you rearrange this equation, what do you get? SF equal to n square into q square divided by, oh, there's a mistake over here. Oh, I'm sorry, this should not be a square. I wrote it incorrectly over here. It should be a, right? Q equal to 1 by n a r to the power 2 by 3 SF per half. So when I do SF, it will be n square into q square divided by a square into r power 4 by 3, right? So that will be SF. But this SF, you can evaluate it at all the points at I and I plus 1. So What is SF bar? SF bar will be SFI plus SFI plus 1 divided by 2. So that is why this divided by 2 is over here. Is this okay? Any questions on how I got this? How I got SF bar? I have simply taken SF at I plus 1, added it to SF at I, and divided it by 2. This n square q square is a common term, so I have taken it outside. Otherwise, I could have written it inside. N square q square divided by a I plus 1 square r I plus 1 4 by 3 plus n square q square and so on. Because it's common term, I've just taken it outside. This is independent of the q is independent of the location. The flow rate is the same at all these points, because remember, this is steady flow. Okay, and then n is the Manning's roughness coefficient. We are assuming that that also cannot change in this channel section. So I'll keep n as constant. Q is anyway constant because the flow is steady. Only A and R are changing as a function of the section. Right? Is that all right? Okay, so let's just erase this. We'll keep moving. All right. So that's how you'll compute EI and SF. So now you just put those numbers in there and you keep solving for delta X, right? You go from I equal to 1 to I equal to N, right? Or from I equal to 1 to I equal to N minus 1, because you have to, N minus 1 will give you the last piece. Is that okay? So it's a computational approach to compute the length of the gradually varied flow profile. Any questions? All right. Okay. So we are going to, okay, in applying this, there's a few hints that you need to remember. Okay. One, most important one, is that these calculations that you're doing, they must always proceed in the upstream direction if the flow is subcritical, and downstream direction if the flow is supercritical. Right? Do you understand what this means? So if you go back to the, look at this, what does it say? It should proceed upstream in subcritical flows and downstream in supercritical flows. What this means is, let's just go back to this figure. See, in this figure, you see, I have marked 1 at the downstream end and N at the upstream end, right? So it is going from 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to N in this direction. So this is what you will do if the flow is subcritical, right? You go from the downstream end towards the upstream end. You'll do that if the flow is subcritical. If the flow is supercritical, Y1 will be here and YN will be over here. Okay. The reason for this is because you want to minimize the errors, right? So when you're moving in the downstream direction, in the case of subcritical flow, typically you are approaching the normal depth at the other end. So whenever you approach the normal depth, what happens to the dy by dx? When you approach normal depth, what happens to dy by dx? Zero. Does everybody recollect that? As y tends to y naught, the normal depth, dy by dx tends to 0, right? So therefore, most of the time when you're computing subcritical cases, you will be approaching the normal depth at one end. Okay. So therefore, you need to approach it from the other end. So therefore, so the errors don't add up. Okay. So that is one of the hints. It's very important to remember. Okay. So calculations proceed in the upstream direction in the case of subcritical flows and in the downstream direction in the case of supercritical flows. That's number one. Then the next useful hint to remember is that the steps need not be equal increments, right? So going from y1 to yn, you don't have to go in equal steps. So if y1 is 3 and yn is 4, for example, you don't have to do 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4. You don't have to go in equal steps. You can take larger steps, right? You can take larger steps in the regions where the gradient is small, and take smaller steps when the gradient is small, right? So that kind of flexibility you have. You can take steps in unequal. You can move in unequal steps. Okay. Then you will not go all the way to y naught. You will typically stop your calculations before you reach y naught. Right? You will terminate the calculations at within 1% of y naught. You understand what this means? You terminate your calculations when you approach y naught. You don't stop at y naught, because when you approach y naught, what happens to dy by dx? Just now you answered it. As you approach y naught, dy by dx becomes very, very small. Right? So then you will not even, it will asymptotically approach y naught. So you will never reach y naught. Okay, so therefore we always stop the calculations. See, because this is a numerical approach, you need to know when to stop. You have to approach it asymptotically. So therefore you stop when you're within 1% of y naught, you stop. So if you're approaching it from the higher side, you will stop at 101%. So that's why this 1 plus or minus 0.01. If you're approaching it from the bottom side, from below, you will stop at 99%. Right? So you understand what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, if this is your normal depth, oh, badly drawn. 1 second. So if this is your normal depth, okay, and I have a profile that is approaching it, it'll approach, oops, sorry. It'll approach like that. Oops, again, I'm sorry. It'll approach asymptotically. It'll never reach y naught. So instead of trying to reach y naught, you should stop at 1.01 y naught. Okay. Or if you're approaching it from the bottom, same thing. It'll never approach, because it'll keep asymptotically going towards y naught. So then again, you will stop within at 99% of y naught. So if y naught is 3, you will stop at 3.03 when you're approaching it from above, and you will stop at 2.97 when you're approaching it from below. Is that okay? Is that clear? All right. Okay. Then the last piece of advice, or the hint, is that the accuracy obviously depends on the number of steps. This is fairly obvious, right? If I break it up into more number of pieces and compute delta x for each small piece, you will get a more accurate answer. Whereas if I break it up into 3 pieces, for example, you will get a less accurate answer, because you are approximating the difference between that energy slope. Remember, SF bar is SFI plus SFI plus 1 divided by 2. As long as I and I plus 1 are relatively close to each other, that approximation is appropriate to use that approximation. But if I and I plus 1 are very, very far away, then taking the average of two numbers that are very different may not always give you the best result. Okay. So this is fairly obvious, right? If I break it up into 3 steps, the accuracy will be much less. If I break it up into 10 steps, it will be better. If I break it up into 100 steps, it will be even better. Okay, and so on. If you keep increasing it, it will get better and better. But beyond a certain point, you don't care about accuracy. Whether you get, whether the length of the profile comes out to be 10 kilometers or 10.1 kilometers, it doesn't make a big difference, right? As long as you got to 10 kilometers, it's okay. It can be slightly plus or minus 100 meters. That's okay. You don't care about accuracy so much. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to solve one simple problem. There's an Excel file that I've created for this. I'll share that with you, so that you can also understand how this approach. I've just copied the Excel file into the PowerPoint file, so you'll understand what we are doing. So let's just read the problem. A river 100 meters wide and 3 meters deep has an average bed slope of so and so. Okay. Estimate the length of the GVF profile produced by a low dam which raises the water surface just upstream of it by 1.5 meters. Assume Manning's roughness coefficient equal to so and so, 0.035. Okay. So it's given to you that the width of the river and the depth of the river, and the bed slope is given. Everything else is given to you. Okay. So it is told to you that this dam is raising the water surface by 1.5 meters, right? So from 3 meters, the water surface is becoming 4.5 meters. Okay. So the objective is to try to find what length, over what length will this water depth change from 3 meters to 4.5 meters. Okay, so that's the objective. So now here we are going to make use of one approximation, right? So the river is, you can see the difference between the depth and the width. The width is 100 meters, whereas the depth is only 3 meters. Okay, so whenever you have this kind of a wide rectangular channel, we will approximate R as being almost equal to Y. Okay, can anybody guess why this is the reason? When you have a wide rectangular channel, I'm saying R is approximately equal to Y. WHY. Why?
R equal to A by P.
Yeah.
A equal to B,
B into Y.
and then dividing by perimeter.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just quickly. I'll just quickly write that, and then we'll. Okay, right. R equal to A by P, which is B into Y divided by B plus 2Y. Right. So when B is much greater than Y, B plus 2Y is approximately the same as B, right? So BY divided by B, because B is so much greater than, so whether you divide it by 100 or 106, it's the same thing, right? So therefore this approximately becomes equal to Y. Is that okay? So R is approximately equal to Y, but this is only true when it's a wide rectangular channel. If the width of the river is 5 meters, you can't use this. Since the river is 100 meters wide and only 3 meters deep, in these situations, you can use this approximation because it makes our calculations a little bit easier. Okay. Instead of struggling with A by P and calculating A by P and all that, you can simply approximate R equal to Y. Okay. All right. So, okay. Now we will estimate Q. If you remember, small q is the flow rate per unit width, right? Capital Q is 1 by n A into R power 2 by 3 S naught per half, right? But if I write, if you remember, Q equal to 1 by n A into R to the power 2 by 3 S naught to the power half, right? Now R, I'm saying it is R is approximately equal to Y, right? So it will be Q equal to 1 by n. A is B into Y into Y power 2 by 3 into S naught power half. Is this okay? So A, I've replaced A with B into Y, and R I've replaced it with Y, right? So then if I divide both sides by B, I'll get small q, which is flow rate per unit width, 1 by n into Y power 2 by 3. So that becomes Y power 5 by 3 into S naught power half. Is this okay? So this makes our calculations much more easier, right? So we use this since it's a wide rectangular channel, we use this R approximately being equal to Y to our advantage and make the calculation much more easier by computing the flow rate per unit width instead of the flow rate, total flow rate. Is that okay? All right. So I've computed the flow rate per unit width. It is 3.987 cubic meters per second per meter, right? So remember the units here. It's cubic meters per second per meter. So if I want the total flow rate, I simply multiply this by the total width of the channel, 100 meters. I'll get the total flow rate. Okay. So I've got small q now. Okay. Now the next thing, critical depth. I can compute the critical depth also. What is critical depth? Critical depth is q square by g to the power 1 by 3. This I'll leave it to you. You can figure it out very easily. It's a rectangular channel. I've got q square t by ga cubed equal to 1, right? So if you rewrite it in terms of what's that? In terms of the small flow rate per unit width, small q, you will get this expression. Okay, and then you rearrange the terms. You'll get this yc equal to q square by g to the power 1 by 3. So that becomes 1.175 meters. Okay, so I have found out that the normal depth is 3 meters and the critical depth is 1.175 meters, right? So what kind of slope should this be? Normal depth is 3 meters. Critical depth is 1.175 meters. What kind of slope is this?
Mild.
Mild slope, right? And then in which region is this curve going to be? The curve is going from 3 meters to 4.5 meters. Is it region 1, region 2, or region 3?
3.
Okay, so let's just quickly draw this. So I have the bottom of the channel. Then I have the normal depth line. Oh, I should use a different color. I'm sorry. So let's use black for the bottom of the channel. Then I'm going to use red for the critical depth line. Then I'll use maybe pink for the normal depth line. Okay. So normal depth in this case is 3 meters. That is over here. Critical depth is 1.175. That is over here, the red line. And then the bottom is here. So the region above the topmost line is region 1. So this is region 1. This is region 1. This is region 2. And this is region 3. So in this case, the flow depth is changing from 3 meters to 4.5 meters. So the entire curve is going to be in region 1, right? And it is a mild slope. Okay. So therefore, we can make some conclusions here. We can arrive at some conclusions here. So the depth of the downstream end is 4.5. Since y is greater than y naught greater than yc, the profile is an M1 curve. Okay, so we've established that it's an M1 curve. It's a mild slope and it is in region 1. Therefore, the curve is an M1 curve. All right. Now, our job is to solve this curve profile from y equal to 3 meters to y equal to 4.5 meters using 10 steps. We're going to use 10 steps. Okay. So I've just shown the entire table, but I'll just walk you through the first 2 rows. The rest of the table is just following that same policy. Okay. So now, if it is a mild slope, is the flow subcritical or supercritical? If it is a mild slope, that means that the normal depth of flow is greater than the critical depth of flow. If the depth of flow is greater than the critical depth, what kind of flow is it? Subcritical or supercritical? Subcritical. Does everybody agree with that? So that's why I asked that poll question in the beginning. So most of you answered in the right manner. So I'm assuming that you understand this. If the normal depth of flow is greater than the critical depth, then you say that this is a mild slope. Okay. So we have established it's a mild slope. Then if this depth of flow is greater than the critical depth, then that is a subcritical flow. The entire flow is happening in the subcritical regime. So if you remember the hint, when the flow is subcritical, you go from the downstream end to the upstream end. The calculation proceeds from the downstream end to the upstream end. Calculations proceed in the upstream direction, right? So in this case, the downstream point is at an elevation of 4.5 meters, right? If you remember, there's a dam at the downstream end, which has raised the elevation to 4.5 meters. The upstream end, the elevation is 3 meters. So our calculation will proceed from the downstream end, which is at 4.5 meters, towards the upstream end, which is at 3 meters. But since we can't stop at 3, right? Because 3 is normal depth, dy by dx will tend to 0 there. So we stop at 101% of 3. So that is 3.03. So the calculation starts from 4.5 and goes towards 3.03. Okay. And stops at 3.03. And if you notice, I'm taking steps, unequal steps. Initially, I take equal steps. 0.2 meters, 0.2 meters, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. And then when I get close to my answer, I take smaller steps. 0.05, 0.02. And I'm taking smaller steps and I'm computing the consequences. Okay, so these are all known values of y. I'm just assuming some values. This is completely at my freedom. I can choose whatever number I want between 4.5 and 3.03. I can take any number as long as it is proceeding, logically from 4.5 to 3.03. I can take any size I want. Okay. So at each point, I compute the velocity. I've already computed the discharge, right? Discharge per unit width. I've computed discharge per unit width. So can I not find V? Once I know Y and discharge, I can find V, right? What is V given? So let me write that. Q equal to V into Y, right? Because it's a rectangular cross section, small q equal to V into Y. Capital Q is equal to V into B into Y. I've divided both sides by B. I'm getting small q equal to velocity, average velocity of the cross section multiplied by depth of the cross section. The depth of the cross section is known. Q we have already solved for 3.987 cubic meters per second per meter. So you can find V very easily. Q divided by Y. So 3.987 divided by 4.5, that is the velocity here. Similarly, for every point, I'm calculating the velocity. Right? So the second column is also very easy. Then the third column is even more easy. Once I know Y and V, I can calculate E very easily. Y plus V square by 2G. So I get all these numbers. Third column is E, which is Y plus V square by 2G. So I compute all these values of E. Then I compute delta E. What is delta E? EI plus 1 minus EI. Right? EI plus 1 minus EI. So remember, you are proceeding from the downstream end to the upstream end. So downstream end will be, this is location 1, this is location 2, location 3, location 4, and so on. So delta E will be EI plus 1 minus EI. So 4.3438, which is the specific energy at location 2, minus the specific energy at location 1, which is 4.54. So I get some negative number. Right there, and similarly I compute all these delta E's at every cross section. Then I compute SF. How do I compute SF? You remember n square q square by a square r power 4 by 3. Right? So SF will be, SF at every cross section I have to compute. It is n square q square divided by a square r to the power 4 by 3. Okay. So I compute this at every point. Oh, here again, of course, I have to replace it with small q. Right? So this will become small q square. The denominator will become y square. Right? Because a square is b into y, b square, y square. So q square by b square will become small q square. You understand what I'm doing here? So this entire expression, you can write it in terms of n, small q, and y. Right? Because r is approximately equal to y, because it's a wide rectangular cross section. Right? So this SF you can very easily compute. Okay, then you compute SF, SFI, SFI plus 1. You do that for all these locations. Then you compute SF bar. What is SF bar? SFI plus SFI plus 1 divided by 2. So the average of these two terms is this term. So this number is the average of 1.4 into 10 power minus 4 is the average of these two numbers. So I've computed SF bar. Then I compute S0 minus SF bar. S0 is already given in the problem, 0.0005 or something like that. So I take that and subtract this SF bar and compute that over here. That is this column. Then delta X is simply delta E divided by S0 minus SF bar. So I take this delta E and divide it by S0 minus SF bar, I get the delta X. Right? So then I'll get a negative number here. This negative simply implies that I'm going in the direction opposite to the flow direction. Right? Flow is actually happening from 4.3 meters to 4.5 meters. But since I'm computing delta X going from 4.5 to 4.3, I get a negative number. But that negative has no physical meaning. It's just a mathematical thing. So it means the distance between these two locations is 545 meters. Similarly, I do it between every successive y depth. I compute all these values of delta X, and then I cumulative distance is given over here. Right? This column is the cumulative distance. So this one is 4.5 meters is at x equal to 0. At x equal to 545, y is equal to 4.3. At x equal to 1126, y equal to 4.1. What is 1126? 545 plus 581.5. So this summation of these two is giving you this number. 1126 plus 634, 1760. 1760 plus 715, 2475, whatever. So then I go all the way to 3.03, I get 8.6 kilometers, right? So that's what the length of this M1 curve is. It is changing from 3 meters to 4.5 meters, which is hardly 1.5 meters, right? Very small distance, very small difference in depth, but it takes 8.6 kilometers for this change of depth to happen, right? So imagine this, you can't even visualize it. If you go and stand there, you can't see any change because it is so gradual. This curvature is so small that it takes 8.6 kilometers for the depth to change by only 1.5 meters. Okay, so it's a very gradual slope. So that's why we call it a gradually varied flow profile. All right. So any questions? Right. I'll send out a set of problems that you can solve to get familiarized with this. You know, you can this, and of course, if you go online, there's lots of problems available. There's lots of material available. In any case, I'll send out a problems set today. You can solve that also and get acclimatized with solving these problems. Okay. So with that, we are done with gradually varied flow. I have one more lecture ready. So let me quickly share the screen for that. So that is lecture number 7. Okay. Can you see the screen? Can you see lecture 7? Anybody, please?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now we are going to discuss quickly about just like we had, you know, Venturi meter and orifice meter, which are devices to measure the flow rate in a pipe. We also have devices that can measure flow rate in a channel, open channel. Those are called weirs. Okay. So I'll go through this very quickly. This is a very, very simple lecture. I already sent you the video. You can watch it again. It's not very difficult. So forgive me if I'm going too fast now because there's only about 15 minutes left in the class. So I'll go a little bit fast. Okay. So weir is basically an obstruction in the channel of some height. Okay. This channel obstruction is essentially supposed to make it such that the water flows over the weir. Okay. If I obstruct the flow of water, the water will rise above it and then flow over it, right? So this obstruction, what it does is it basically causes the water to back up to some height. So the water will, to continue the flow, the water will, height of the water surface will increase so that it can flow over this obstruction, which is the weir, right? So I'll just show you a quick example of a weir. So imagine I have a channel like this where I construct an obstruction to the flow of some height. Okay. So naturally for the flow to continue to take place, the water depth will increase and then it will flow over the weir like this. Okay. So that is the basic functioning of a weir. Okay. I obstruct the flow such that water increases in height and then it flows over the weir. Okay. So now the interesting thing is the height that it rises up behind the weir, this height above the weir that the water level rises up, the flow rate is proportional to the depth of flow that it rises up above the weir. Okay. So now this is something that I would like you to think about. Why is this the case? We'll anyway prove it in one of the coming up slides. So you'll see that. But generally speaking, this Q is proportional to H in some way. Okay. It's also fairly intuitive. If the flow rate is high, then this the height to which the water will back up will be more. If the flow rate is low, the height to which the water will back up will be less, right? So this is fairly intuitive, fairly obvious. Okay. The interesting thing is that the primary role for a weir is that it can help to store water, right? Suppose I don't have this obstruction. Okay. All the water will just flow away. And when the rain stops, then channel will be mostly dry. So the primary role is to store water, right? So you can store water to some height in the channel and you can use it for some purposes, maybe for irrigation or whatever. The interesting thing is that you can also use this weir as a device to measure the flow rate in the channel. The primary role is storing water. Okay. This is an added benefit. The fact that you can use the weir to also measure the flow rate is an added benefit. That was not intended. The intention was to store water. Incidentally, we are also able to measure the flow rate. So it's an additional benefit that we have. Okay. So I'll quickly go over the different types of weirs. one example is, I've already showed you one example. I'll talk about that a little bit later. One example of this kind of an obstruction is what is called a broad crested weir, right? So you see over here, the weir is an obstruction to the flow. The crest means the top, right? So the top of this weir is very broad. So here you can see that it's not very broad, right? The obstruction is very narrow. Here I have a broad crest. Crest means the top. Okay, the top is very broad. So I have an obstruction which has a broad crest. So that kind of an obstruction is called a broad crested weir. Okay, this is one example. Then another example is what is called an ogee shaped weir. So this ogee shaped weir is essentially, the idea is to shape this weir in such a way that this shape is mimicking the shape of the water as it flows over the weir. Okay, I'm not very clear why it's called ogee shaped, but that is what it is called in the literature, in the books. So we'll just call it that. I have to find out why it is called ogee shaped. Okay, so this is another example of a weir. It's an ogee shaped weir. Another typical example is a sharp crested weir, which is what you see over here, the first one that I showed, right? The crest means the top of the weir is sharp. Unlike in this one where it's a broad crested weir, here I have a sharp crested weir. Okay, so these are some common examples of weirs. Not only is this is in the longitudinal direction, right? But also in the cross-sectional view, if you look at it, they can also have different shapes, right? So this sharp crested weir can also have a rectangular shape. This rectangular shape is perpendicular to the direction of flow. So if the flow is happening from left to right, if I look at this, the cross section perpendicular to the direction of flow, it can have any shape. It can be a rectangular obstruction, rectangular opening, or a trapezoidal opening, or a triangular, or what is called V notch, or it could be a compound section, something like this. Okay, so different kinds of shapes are possible. These different shapes are basically for different purposes, right? Sometimes rectangular shape is more suitable for higher flow rates, whereas a triangular shape is more suitable for a lower flow rates. Okay, so these kinds of different shapes are available to measure the flow rate. All right. Okay, so from here on, we are going to come up with a theory which will allow us to estimate the flow rate, given that we know the height h. Okay, our objective here is to estimate Q if I know h. All right. So we'll take the example of a sharp crested weir. Okay, so let us take a sharp crested weir of some height, capital P. So imagine this sharp crested weir of some height P, which is backing up water to a certain height, capital H, above the behind the weir. Okay, so imagine this kind of a situation. Now I'm going to define some terms. This water that flows over the weir, this portion of that water is called the nappe, N-A-P-P-E, nappe. Okay, so this water that's flowing over the weir is called the nappe. Then I also have, so the water surface, if you go behind the weir, the water surface is more or less undisturbed. It is at some height h. But as you approach the weir, the water surface gently starts to curve and then flows over the weir, right? So this is something very intuitive. You can very easily imagine this, that the water surface will gently start to curve and fall over the weir. So because of that, we've discussed this already when we're talking about gradually varied flow profiles. This the water surface will start to drop down. Okay, so as I approach this, okay, somebody's sent a chat. 1 second. Okay, I'm seeing it late. All right. So there's what is called drawdown. Okay, this drawdown is the drop in the water surface as the water passes over the weir. Okay, so this drawdown is something that you can physically observe when you have a weir. All right. Then the third term that I want to introduce is this ventilation. Okay, so this water that flows over the weir, this theory that we're going to develop is only for those cases when this nappe is ventilated, which means it is experiencing atmospheric pressure on this side, right? Sometimes if this flow rate is very low, right, then the water will just simply flow like this. You might have seen this. Okay, if the flow rate is very low, the water depth will be very low like this, and it will not flow out like that. It will just flow like this. So the water will just stick to the surface and flow. Right? When this kind of thing happens, whatever theory we are going to develop is not suitable for these situations. Only when the depth is greater, you get this kind of a nice jet that falls out. when this nice jet of water falls out, this nap is ventilated, which means that it is experiencing atmospheric pressure on both sides, right? So this side also is atmospheric pressure. This side is also at atmospheric pressure. This is very important. If it is sticking to the weir, then it doesn't have atmospheric pressure on one side, only atmospheric pressure on the other side. So then that makes it a little bit challenging to understand those kinds of scenarios. So we are only interested in these kinds of scenarios where the nap is ventilated. Okay. All right. So we'll quickly derive the equation for this. What we are going to do is we are going to apply Bernoulli between sections 1 and 2. Section 1 is basically far away from the weir, sufficiently far away from the weir, not very far away. And section 2 is right at the weir. Okay. So I'm going to consider a point along section 2, which is at a height of small h from the water surface. Okay. We're going to consider a point at section 2, which is at a distance of or a depth of small h from the water surface. Okay. I'm going to write Bernoulli equation between these two sections. Okay. So at cross section 1, Bernoulli equation will be capital P plus capital H plus V1 square by 2G equal to, at cross section 2, it will be capital P plus capital H minus small h, that is the elevation head at this point, plus V2 square by 2G. Okay. So now, does everybody agree with this equation? Is this equation okay? Or any questions about this equation? We have made an assumption in this equation. Are you able to notice what that assumption is? This capital P plus capital H is the elevation head at the surface, right? Capital P plus capital H minus small h is the elevation head at this point. And then I have V1 square by 2G and V2 square by 2G. At the surface, the pressure is atmospheric. So if you add atmospheric over here, that's okay. Atmospheric pressure we are going to ignore because it is constant everywhere. But what about the right hand side? Why have I ignored atmospheric pressure at this point? I have not written atmospheric pressure on the right hand side. Or I should write whatever the pressure is at this point. What is the pressure at this point? If I take a similar point, at this location and write Bernoulli for that point, then I'll have to write, the pressure at this point, which will be greater than atmospheric pressure. But at this point, when the water is beginning to fall like a free jet, right? I have a free jet of water, right? Here I have a free jet, right? Because I have a free jet of water here, the free jet is exposed to atmosphere on all sides. That is why I said this nap is ventilated, right? So that's very important. Okay. So therefore I've ignored atmospheric pressure, or I've not ignored atmospheric pressure. The assumption is that the pressure at section 2 is atmospheric pressure. And the logic for that is that because this at point 2, the jet is falling as a free jet, right? The water is falling as a free jet. Therefore, it is exposed to atmospheric pressure on all sides. Therefore, the pressure at section 2 will be atmospheric pressure. So therefore, atmospheric pressure here, they cancel out. Therefore, this equation is okay. Right? Okay. So now I'll cancel out P and H on both sides and take this small h to the other side. I get this expression V2 equal to under root 2GH plus V1 square. Right? Very simple. Then I make one more assumption. Velocity at this cross section will be much lesser than the velocity at this cross section, right? V1 will be much smaller than V2 because the flow rate is the same at both cross section 1 and 2, but the area of cross section is much larger at A1 compared to A2, right? So therefore, since A1 is much larger than A2, V1 will be much smaller than V2. So therefore, I'm ignoring this V1 and I'm approximating V2 as under root 2GH. Very convenient, right? V2 approximately equal to under root 2GH. Very easy. Okay. So now I know the velocity at this point. Now I need to integrate this velocity across this entire depth, multiply by the cross-sectional area. I'll get the flow rate. Simple, right? So I'm going to assume that the weir is a triangular weir. Okay, we'll do it for a triangle. You can do it for any shape, right? So this section, I have already found out what the velocity at a depth of small h is, right? If I'm able to find out the velocity at every point along this and integrate that by the and multiply it by the area of the cross section, that will give me the total flow rate, right, through this cross section. That's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to assume that the cross section is a triangle. Assume that the weir is a triangular weir, okay, or what is called a V notch. So this V notch, let us say it has an angle of theta, which means this half angle is theta by 2. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll consider an element of size dh at a depth of h. At a depth of h from the water surface, I'm considering an element of size dh, right? So then what will be the flow through this element? The flow through this element is simply dq equal to the velocity at this section. Velocity will be under root 2gh. We just derived that in the previous slide. Velocity is under root 2gh multiplied by the area of this slide, area of this element. What is the area of this element? You can simply use geometry, you will get this. The area of this element is the length of this element multiplied by the thickness. The thickness is dh. The length is 2 times capital H minus small h into tan theta by 2. Okay. So this you can use geometry. It's very easy. So then what do I do to get the total Q? I simply integrate this entire thing from small h equal to 0 to small h equal to capital H, right? So total Q is equal to, I'm taking out common the terms that are outside the integration. 2 under root 2g tan theta by 2 are all independent of h. So I take them out of the integration, and then I have the integral 0 to capital H, 0 to capital H of the remaining terms, capital H minus small h into under root h dh, right? So I solve this integral and I get the expression Q equal to 8 by 15 under root 2g tan theta by 2 h power 5 by 2. Okay, so if you solve this integral, you will get this term. It's very, very easy, not at all difficult. Okay, so this is the theoretical flow through the V notch. If I have a rectangular shape, I'll have a different expression here. If I have a trapezoidal shape, I'll have a different expression, and so on. Okay, so you can very easily do that and derive the expression for the different shapes. Okay, but remember, this is the theoretical flow rate. In reality, you'll have to apply a coefficient of discharge, right? If you remember, even for Venturi meter and orifice meter, we had applied this concept of a coefficient of discharge. So the Q actual will be some coefficient of discharge multiplied by the theoretical flow rate, 8 by 15 under root 2g whatever, tan theta by 2 h power 5 by 2. All right. So this is the flow rate through a triangular weir or a V notch for a sharp crested weir. So next thing we are going to consider is a O. So these are all the assumptions that we went through. So we assume that the nap is ventilated. We assume that the drawdown is insignificant. Where did we assume this? Can anybody catch where we made this assumption?
We integrated till 0 to h.
Correct, right? So in this previous slide, we integrated small h from 0 to h. But in reality, if you go back to the previous slide, you remember this, right? This small h does not go from 0 to h. It's actually very close to h, but not exactly completely. Small h goes from 0 to some value less than h. But we are assuming that this drawdown is insignificant. So therefore, we are able to integrate from 0 to h. Right? So this integral from 0 to h, we have assumed that the drawdown is insignificant. Okay, so that's one more assumption. Then this assumption we already spoke about. Then we've also ignored frictional losses, right? We've ignored frictional losses. So that's why we use the coefficient of discharge, CD. Okay, so this is as far as the sharp crested weir is concerned. Then for a broad crested weir, we'll consider a broad crested weir of height P, and the water is backing up to some height h behind the weir. Then we'll apply Bernoulli between cross section 1 and 2 over here. At cross section 2, I'm saying that the flow depth is equal to YC. YC, if you remember, YC is your critical depth, right? I'm saying that if the incoming flow is subcritical, okay, we are assuming that the incoming flow is subcritical. If the incoming flow is subcritical, then the flow depth at the weir will be critical depth. Can anybody guess the reason for this? If you already watched the video, you will know the answer. If not, if you remember in our uniform flow, we had a small bump in the channel, right? When you have a small bump or a small hump in the channel, the flow depth from subcritical, it becomes less subcritical. But if I keep increasing that hump, if I keep increasing the bump in the channel, beyond a certain point, the flow at the downstream point will become critical, right? So same idea is being used here. So the flow at the weir will become critical. Okay. So therefore we can exploit that, and we can write Bernoulli between cross section 1 and 2 as P plus H plus V1 square by 2G equal to P plus YC plus VC square by 2G. What is VC? VC is the corresponding critical velocity corresponding to critical depth. Corresponding to this YC, I'll have VC. Okay. So I've already answered why VC and YC, because the flow is critical at this cross section. Okay. So now we can also take advantage of this. If you remember, when the flow is critical, V by under root GY equal to 1, right? Or Froude number equal to 1. So assuming that this is a rectangular cross section, we can approximate it as VC equal to under root GYC. So if we use this in this expression, what will you get? VC square will be GYC divided by 2G. So VC square by 2G will become YC by 2, right? P plus YC by 2. This expression will become simply YC by 2. So you will get 3YC by 2 equal to H plus V1 square by 2G. So if you rearrange that, you will get YC equal to 2H by 3 plus V1 square by 3G, which again, with the same assumption, we'll assume that V1 is very small. So we will approximate it as YC approximately equal to 2H by 3. Okay. Then we will use this YC to find out the flow rate. So the flow rate will be Q actual equal to CD times B into GYC cubed, under root GYC cubed. This again, you can use your critical flow assumption, right? This, if you do use your Q square T by GA cubed equal to 1, you can very easily find out what this relationship is, right? And then you of course have to multiply it by the coefficient of discharge, right? Because we have made so many assumptions in this. We have ignored friction and all that. Okay, so that's a broad crested weir. Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of weirs and the discussion on weirs. So any questions? Any questions? I know I went a little bit fast in this weir portion, but I strongly encourage you to watch that YouTube link that I sent, in which I've gone through it a little bit slowly. It's anyway available. You can pause it and watch it, and it's not very difficult. Okay, if you have questions, of course you are free to contact me, by any of the means given here. You can email me, phone, WhatsApp, whatever. So any questions? Okay, so next class is going to be the last class for the semester. We will talk about the very final topic, which is called rapidly varied flow, RVF. Okay, just like gradually varied flow, it's another form of non-uniform flow, but again the flow is steady. We will be discussing about rapidly varied flow in next class. Okay, so as usual, stay safe, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll meet on Friday. All right, thank you very much.